It's 5 o'clock in London. It's midday in New York. During the process of this UN Climate Week, as you're watching this, it's midnight in Hong Kong, 2 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 9:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID live stream, Series 31, Episode 5. That is in the aggregate. Episode number 185 starts here. Very exciting moves in the world of exchanges in the course of the last couple of weeks. Of course, the Jamaica Stock Exchange has finally chosen a new leader. The former deputy governor of the Jamaica Central Bank, Livingston Morrison, is going to be taking over after a lengthy CEO search from the 2-decade-long term of the indomitable, the amazing and retiring Marlene Street Forrest, whom we wish all the very, very best in her long-standing and well-deserved retirement. Over in India, NSE IPO is looking much more like it's going to be a reality. Blue-blooded AAA graded bureaucrat being appointed as the NSE chairman. Srinivas Injeti, we were mentioning him just a couple of weeks ago as going to be on the board of NSE. Barely a week or so later, and he becomes the chairman. Wonderful to see, as well as that, a voice for the marketplace, the parish of exchanges, as well as a voice for Israel and a leader in the market, as he put his own remarks. Bill Ackman, the legendary fund manager, ringing the opening bell at the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange in support of Israel's economy, noting as a stakeholder in that Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, owning an exchange is like owning a royalty on the success of a country. Fabulous words there, and we're looking forward to a fantastic show today, ladies and gentlemen. It's not actually a panel format per se. We've got three magnificent authors of our topic today, The Carbon Paradox, which happens to be their book, which is being published during the UN Climate Week in New York. We're delighted to be able to bring you this show. I have to admit, we are recording this because, of course, understandably, our guests today, Steve Zwick, Renat Heuberger, and Marco Hirsbrunner, have a fabulously busy schedule in New York. So here you go. You're going to get some of the skinny. We're recording this while I'm in Valletta, Malta. Delighted to welcome back to the show Steve Zwick. Of course, as you well know, Steve's been here many times. He's a former futures broker and trader. He writes about the economics of sustainable development and the interplay between land use, climate change, and all sorts of subjects that he's developed a fascination for in a 30-year career that brought him from Chicago's trading pits and led to subsistence farms in rural parts of Kenya, Vietnam, and Brazil, and many trips to exciting other yurt-born places. Renat Heuberger, making his debut on IPO-VID, is a Swiss climate activist, serial entrepreneur, and impact investor. He has launched and led several pioneering sustainability ventures and organizations, including myclimate, South Pole, and Terra Impact Ventures. By no means least, our third co-author today, Marco Hirsbrunner, is a Swiss serial entrepreneur and impact investor. He co-founded Terra Impact Ventures, where he leads operations and drives the growth of sustainability-focused startups. He also serves as co-CEO of Svarmi, an Icelandic company specializing in geospatial and nature data. Gentlemen, welcome all of you to the show. Let me start with you, Marco. Tell me, how did you first get involved as a serial entrepreneur from Switzerland in the entire carbon movement?
Well, that's an interesting question. Actually, it's linked to the question how I met Renat. So I have to quickly go into that. So I was actually just backpacking in Mongolia when Renat also arrived in Mongolia, and we have a common friend. And he looked out for me. He knew my name and found me on the book of guest house, on the guest book. So he reached out to me, and then we traveled together and had a couple of really interesting adventures. And he was on his way to Indonesia overland. I was on my way to China. I then studied Chinese science, and we met a couple of times over the next years. And I just knew whenever he starts something new, I want to be part of it. And then when he started South Pole, I happened to be in China. Actually, I happened to be in Tibet, backpacking again. And he told me, well, there's a conference you need to attend for us, and you need to join us now. And there's a lot of climate action that we need to do in China. And so you have 2 weeks to get a suit and name cards. See you there in Beijing. And that's how it went. And then we had founded South Pole, and started really very successfully, actually, from the start, doing projects. One of the first projects that we jointly did in China was actually related to protecting the panda, which is a symbol for nature conservation. And we've had a lot of really interesting experiences ever since. And I just said to myself, I have to stick to Renat. It's always fun and interesting.
So very interesting. Let me ask you something. So you end up this very exotic locale where you meet, but I mean, how far away do you actually come from each other, Marco?
Well, yeah, it's a good. So we're at opposite sides of Zurich. So we're both from villages a little bit outside of the city of Zurich, but we haven't met before we met in Mongolia.
Quite interesting. You have to go from wherever it was, Opfikon and Zolikon, in order to manage to meet in Mongolia. That's certainly quite far-flung canton to manage to meet in. So Renat, I mean, tell me from your side, what really drove you into this industry?
So in my case, the story goes back to 1993 when I did an exchange year, not in Mongolia, but in Indonesia. I was a high school student there. And that was the first time I was exposed to the intersection of what today, of course, we call sustainable development trade-offs. I saw with my own eyes, like disappearing forests. I saw poverty. I saw the struggle of people to make ends meet. And when I came back to Switzerland, I had the strong desire to somehow use the privilege we have in Switzerland to make a difference. Fast forward 10 years later, I realized that unless you find solutions that involve the economy, that involve perhaps our most powerful tool we have, capitalism, to solve problems, things won't scale. And that essentially, fast forward again, drove me to be very excited about financial instruments where nature all of a sudden has a price. The fact that we protect the tree has a price. That fascinated me a lot because once again, it allows us to create profitable business models that actually work in favor of nature and the climate. So that's more or less how we ended up doing those ventures for the past 2 decades.
Fascinating. I think it's a really, really interesting point, the point of trying to find value in everything that you go. Obviously, Steve, I mean, you've been on a somewhat different path. I mean, your I don't know, backpacking, yurt-bearing years came somewhat later than maybe the other guys. But talk to me, I mean, your journey into the carbon finance business has been a fascinating one as well.
Yeah, and it also started really in the 90s, more about sustainable development. I was doing work in Kenya and Rwanda for Deutsche Welle, and one of the problems I kept encountering was whenever I tried to sell a story about entrepreneurs in Africa, it was a non-starter. I felt that even back then, the entire emphasis in media was on wars, conflict, and famine. So I fell into the camp that now is dominated by Dambisa and Mboya and people like that who are advocating for sustainable investment in the continent. And then on the climate front, I gradually became more and more concerned about climate issues. I had read Bill McKibben's book in like 92, and climate was kind of on a back burner for me until we got into about 2002. I started to read more about what was happening. I was still working for Time and Fortune at the time, and I realized that the majors just weren't going to put the resources into covering it properly. So I started to do some work with Ecosystem Marketplace, and then fortunately I was living in Cologne at the time. A lot of the meetings that took place were in Bonn, and I started to spend a lot of time at the offices of the different agencies and entities in Bonn, just kind of hanging around that environment, attending intersessionals, and then Climate Week in Cologne. And interestingly, the very first Climate Week I attended, Patrick, I think you're the one who told me about it. I remember you sent me an email and said, "Hey, there's this big meeting going on right in Cologne," and it was the what they used to have, the European Climate Weeks. So I signed up for that and met Renat in Cologne at one of those. It may have been the very first one. So we've come full circle, because remember I had done a panel in Bergenstock in Switzerland about climate, about the emergence of carbon markets, and it was oh God, I forget the guy's name, but there was one of the people on the panel was involved in nature trading and valuing nature and biodiversity, and so that whole fascination started in Switzerland. Then you had sent me to this, alerted me to this event in Cologne. I met these two, and I've been following Renat's career ever since. I mean, what I like about the guy, at the time they had the myclimate Foundation, and they were talking about creating South Pole, and they are watching them take this germ of an idea and develop it into this major group that invests in nature-based solutions all over the world. It was fascinating to watch, and to finally be able to work with him, I find we've come full circle, and it really just hits me now how much of this journey is centered on Switzerland and you.
That's actually hilarious, because now we've got a situation where we've got two people from either side of Zurich who managed to meet in basically the other side of the world. And you're telling me that the reason that you met Renat in the first place was because an Irishman who was at that stage living in Monaco or Italy was on the board of the Swiss Futures and Options Association headquartered in Geneva that had a meeting in Bergenstock that ultimately got you involved in a panel that you ran, which I remember very, very well. With amongst them Eric Bettelheim and others. And
Eric Bettelheim, yes.
Eric Bettelheim, right. And that caused me to prompt you to go to a conference in Cologne. I didn't realize I was so intimately involved. That's all I can say, but it's great to have you on the show, gentlemen. So, I mean, wow, incredible. Where will globalization end, ladies and gentlemen, apart from the fact that it seems that at all points in time, Switzerland's at the epicenter of everything, which is a wonderful thing. So, I mean, talking about this, obviously, we've accelerated through this. Tell me a little bit, guys, and I'm not sure who wants to go first, maybe Marco. Tell me a little bit about your impact, your venture impact firm, and how that came into being and what that's been doing.
Yeah, so we founded Terra Impact Ventures in November last year, and we basically want to use the experience that we've had with South Pole, scaling from a startup to a multinational, relatively large organization with incredible impact. And we want to take that experience and apply it to other startups as well. So we have 8 companies that we engage with, and they're all having fantastic products, fantastic business models. And now it's all about scaling and finding the right next markets, and lots of decisions that need to be taken that we've already seen, right? It's always the same hurdles that you need to overcome. And so it's very rewarding that we can now apply our experience on these companies.
So, I mean, explain to me just a little bit then, perhaps you could break it down for us, Renat. I mean, what sort of way do you invest in the companies? I mean, probably it's an evolving process from Terra Impact Ventures.
Yeah, so our thesis is that right now we are going through a crisis in the space of environment, sustainability, climate. A lot of geopolitical topics are competing against us. But we believe that that's actually a big opportunity as well, because if you're able to work with the right companies, the right founding teams, the right products, and the market is scaling again, which I'm 100% sure it will, you could actually be in for quite interesting deals these days. So that's what we're doing. We select teams, we work with startups, which we believe have an awesome product, which will scale quite soon when the whole tide turns again. Topic-wise, we are quite open. We're in the fields of renewables, methane avoidance, nature. So it's all the space around solving climate, but all the time with a view of adding impact, social benefit beyond the climate action that we create.
That's very interesting. I'm fascinated actually by the point you make about how it's difficult, challenging, but a good thing to be, as it were, colliding, or at least in competition with so many other global and major trends. how do you manage to make the breakthrough here in order to get your voice heard when there is so much competition for this, and also so many people talking about carbon, the environment, and other sustainability issues in quite different ways?
Well, it already leads us to one of the topics we have in our book, actually. It's one of the paradoxes that is most difficult to solve. We call it the crowd paradox. And if you think about crowds, right? If you go to a football game, a crowd is basically cheering a team to victory. Or if you think about an orchestra, the crowd makes a Beethoven symphony sounding magical. But in climate, paradoxically, it appears that the bigger the crowd becomes, the more people are crowding the conferences, the less we can agree on anything. Because instead of singing the same song with a strong voice, we are basically confusing everybody with so many different views. So one of the wishes and dreams I have is that we can somehow go back to a few years when, in spite of all our differences, in spite of all the different approaches we take, we never forget that ultimately we are trying to achieve the same goal, namely to bring down carbon emissions, make this planet a safer place to live, and at the same time be inclusive, enable opportunities specifically for those people who suffer most from climate change. I hope that those joint narratives, those powerful narratives, those optimistic narratives will be heard much more than we have the situation today. But once again, as discussed before, what I've observed over the past 20 years is that those topics go in up and down cycles. We are right now clearly in a down cycle. So what comes next, I'm quite sure, is going to be better than what we see today.
Interesting. I mean, where do you see that developing, Marco, and what are the opportunities ahead?
Well, I mean, definitely the last couple of years have been really difficult with a lot of developments that have taken the attention away from sustainability and carbon specifically. What is clear is that the fundamental physics about climate change haven't changed, right? So the problem is not going away just because the public pays less attention to it, right? So it's actually building up. We're even seeing that a lot of the predictions have been overly optimistic, and reality turns out to be probably even more severe than was projected. So if you have this fundamental problem that is not going away, eventually you need to have a response as humanity towards that problem. And the longer we wait, the bigger the response needs to be eventually, right? So I agree with Renat that there needs to be an upturn again in the sustainability movement, and we're here to wait until that happens. And while we wait, we build the foundations. We actually now select players that will play a good role in that in that wave that is coming, right? So we're now placing our bets for the next big sustainability wave, so to say, and that is a huge opportunity, of course. Yeah? If you can sustain your business also in a downturn, then the next upturn you're belonging to those who can actually play the biggest role there, right? And so we're preparing for that.
So it's very interesting because we talked a lot so far about this sort of battle for not necessarily hearts and minds, but actually eyeballs in many ways. And I suppose that's part of the motivation for the Carbon Paradox as a book. And I mean, you mentioned it already, Renat, and it's a fabulously engaging, readable tome. If I may say so, I don't think it's what everybody expects to see as a book about these sorts of markets, because it makes you think. It's very engaging. I particularly enjoyed the fact that it doesn't seem to be preaching at me, as could be some of the more disaster-oriented tomes that seem to have been, remarkably making me sort of feel guilty for being a human being, which I find a little bit difficult to try and get through. Not that we shouldn't be responsible. So tell me, I mean, Renat, how did the book come to mind? What motivated you to write the Carbon Paradox together?
There were a number of aspects, but I think the most important one was that after 20 years in carbon, I was frustrated and shocked how little understanding we have beyond our little climate bubble around this instrument, which in my view is one of the most fascinating instruments we have. I mean, climate finance in forms of carbon has just about all aspects you could think of in terms of development finance, all the issues that you see on the ground. It's a fabulously, wonderfully interesting topic, very difficult to understand. And when I reflected then as to why for 2 decades we have been trying to scale this instrument, and it never really, whatever it was scaling, it then kind of collapsed again and scaled again. I started to reflect, why is that? What's actually wrong? And the more I thought about that, the more I realized that there is an astonishing number of fundamental paradoxes underneath that instrument. I started to collect some. I wrote to a few people, including Marco and a few others, and they all came back and said, that's interesting, but here's one more paradox, here's one more. So at some point, we just had a huge collection of paradoxes. The initial idea was to write a scientific paper about those. But then, back to the point I made before, I realized that what if I'm now writing another scientific paper? Nobody's going to read that. The world is flooded with papers and nobody reads them. So how about writing fiction? How about writing a story in the real world with simple dialogues that everybody with an interest can understand, and bring those paradoxes to life? And that was the idea behind it. The goal, of course, is that this instrument becomes understandable, but more than that, our ambition is to just be honest, to tell things the way they are, to stop defending, stop arguing, just lay down the situation, the arguments, the way they are, and have an informed, open, honest, frank discussion as to what could come next, because that's the most important question. What do we learn from all this? How will the next 10, 20 years of climate finance look like? I do hope the book provides inspiration for that.
And I think you raise a very interesting point there, because if I may say so, despite the fact that apparently I was somehow involved indirectly in the genesis of this inadvertently, I mean, one of the things that it strikes me that has been difficult in the genesis of carbon finance is, if I may say so, there's a history of everybody who agrees getting in the same room and kind of agreeing with each other. I know that you're going to say, oh, there are a lot of arguments that are disagreed with, but actually there's not sort of people coming from left field and trying to torpedo the overall thesis of what's going on or what's happening. I'm not saying that that's right, what their thesis is, but generally speaking, I think carbon finance has slightly lacked the ability to have that sort of third-party debate, which I think is interesting about what you've stimulated in the book. Maybe you totally disagree with me, Steve.
No, I agree. I think there were efforts to bring people in. If you look at the genesis of the voluntary carbon standard, which became the verified carbon standard, they bent over backwards to bring in people from all different sectors. They had people from the NGOs, they had people from they invited people from Shell because they wanted people who would be the buyers in there. They really tried to have a big, broad table, and there was just a lack of interest. I think they brought as many people in as they could, and then after them, and I think they did a very good job in the early 2000s of getting multiple eyes on this prize, and then after 2008, when you had the financial crash, everything sort of faded. Climate faded, people lost interest, and then we became much more of a bubble. I think there was a period, and Renat and Marco, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I perceived it was that, we had all this interest, we had multiple people involved. You had Greenpeace and Shell at the same table, which was hard to do. That was Mark Kenber who gets credit for doing that. And then everyone just sort of drifted away, and then it became something very insular. The methodologies, as they evolved, became very technical. It was all scientists and foresters and people who were completely devoted to market solutions. And we kind of plugged along. And then in 2018, when the world awoke to the enormity of the challenge, people started to look to this stuff, and I do think some people had high expectations. Some of the buyers thought these were going to be magical instruments that delivered absolute precision, whereas everybody inside, we knew that we were dealing with all sorts of uncertainties. So I do think there's some truth to that, but it wasn't because of a lack of effort. It was just because people stopped paying attention. That's how I see it.
Interesting. So, I mean, Marco, how do you feel about the general level of the debate in terms of how you've opened it up with the Carbon Paradox as a book?
Yeah, so you had several different stages over the many years in the carbon markets. You had the stage where you had a compliance market, the Kyoto Protocol, and I think Steve said that was maybe a time when it was very technical, right? Then later came the time when suddenly the voluntary markets were the main drivers, and there you needed to engage with the public. You started to have concepts like climate neutral products, and then once they scaled, once the market really started to take off, you started to have a lot of critics who were very, very quick to put their fingers on various parts of the carbon markets, and sometimes maybe forgetting a little bit what the actual, let's say, common enemy here is, right? We want to ensure that there's less pollution, and there was a lot of critique headed against companies that made genuine climate action, and then companies that didn't care at all were completely untouched. Yeah, they were not mentioned, and so you had this paradoxical situation that companies that voluntarily reduced their emissions were blamed for doing so. And I think a lot of people maybe have lost a little bit the actual aim of their critique, or the intentions of their critique. So the discourse became very, very ideological, political, complicated, human, and you had the crowd paradox playing in with so many differentiating opinions that in this cacophony of voices, it was relatively easy to spin stories that discredited the overall efforts. And that's the situation we found ourselves in last year, when we started to think about these paradoxes, when we started to collect them. And that's, I think, what we want to solve with the book, right? We want to provide education, basically, to the wider public, to understand the complexities of the carbon market, but also to understand all the things that have already been thought about. And a lot of things were framed as new discoveries, when actually it's well-known problems, inherent paradoxes of the carbon markets that we've been discussing already over and over for 20 years or more. And so I think we need to really lift the public to the next level in order to have meaningful conversations about climate action in general and carbon markets specifically.
So that's a very interesting point. And let me bring the conversation back to you then, Renat. I mean, looking at your book, and it's a fascinating read altogether. When you're looking at that, and you talk about the paradox, but actually it seems to me the book has many paradoxes within it. I mean, is there a particular element you think is the most important, or is it holistically that you must take all of these different varying forms of paradox together?
I think one of the key messages really in the book is that if you are designing a mechanism to fund projects in the global south, you have to, from the beginning, accept that a lot of things are not perfect and not the way you expected. And some of the reasons why that's the case is based in those fundamental paradoxes. So the book, in a sense, is also a call to action to not expect a perfect world from day one, but to engage in a learning process, learn from projects that happened in the past, talk to your peers, and include as many people as possible in a joint narrative to advance without expecting that things just go perfect all the time. And instead of just making that theoretical argument, we just enjoyed writing a fictional novel. The book actually consists of hundreds of stories. Some happened to us, some happened to other people we know. Everything in this book actually is based on reality. So we call it also fiction based on facts. So all things that happened are not invented. It's that the story is invented, but the underlying issues are issues that anybody encounters. And I think that's also why we got quite good feedback specifically from people from Indonesia, from Peru, from Vietnam, from India, from Zimbabwe, from all those places, because they finally somebody writes about the situation, how it actually is here on the ground, and not from an ivory tower in a theoretical paper. And I think that's the novelty in this book. It really talks about things that actually happen, so people can relate to them.
That's very interesting altogether. You talk about that because certainly something I think that a lot of carbon finance has had an issue with has been a certain degree of ivory tower theoretical approaches that don't necessarily involve the groundwork. And obviously you've got groundwork on several different continents. So explain to me, Steve, I mean, how did you come into the process of the book and therefore help deliver on this groundbreaking message that also relates to how the real world is at the moment?
Yeah, that's interesting. And this is a subject that you and I have talked about a lot on this show, which is that the failure of people in this space to understand and communicate uncertainty. If you're active in the capital markets, you inherently understand that you have to make decisions based on inadequate information, and it's just something. It's the reality that we have. When you're dealing with people who work in NGOs, they have solid, rigid grants, and they get the money. They plot ahead, and results often don't matter. They're often shielded from their results. So this inability to communicate uncertainty is something I've been complaining about for years and writing about for years, and struggling to get it across. And in my case, when Renat came to me with these 25 paradoxes, I just thought, wow, why didn't I think of that? And, he this thing that I've been kind of grappling with for years in this really nebulous, fuzzy way, he broke it into these 25 distinct paradoxes, and then he sent me the draft of the book, and I just saw it was something I had to be a part of. I really was just excited when I saw this solution, and I thought, my God, this is just the perfect way to explain this to people. And it's also really interesting that I've worked on fewer projects than they have, but the story of the Carbon Project that they put together is the story of every carbon project. I was actively working on a project in Kenya as we were writing this, and I'm like reliving the community's paradox, the control paradox. Everything that is in the book was playing out again in real time, just as it had 20 years ago or 15 years ago when I was involved in the first project that I got online with. So I felt like when I saw what they had done, I hope that I was able to try to help with the narrative and bring a slightly different experience in, because they had worked together for 20 years. I had been tangential, but it was really just seeing the 25 paradoxes and seeing the story, seeing the way Renat had created this, these naive kids who are going to plunge into this thing. I'd been trying to tell the story as a history, going back and saying, this is where it begins, this is how we get here. They came up with the idea of saying, no, let's just take some naive kids and throw them into this fully formed thing, because that's how most people come into it anyway. And I just thought it really worked well.
Yes, it's fascinating in a way. I mean, there are more paradoxes, but it does have that certain feeling that you're sort of on a novel of discovery. I mean, it's sort of, for want of a better term, it's a bit like Lord of the Flies Carbon Edition. I mean, you get the inherent, there you go, there's a bit of literature for you, ladies and gentlemen. And that's something to benchmark you against to start with. No, but it does feel like that. I mean, it's the inherent ability. At one level, you've got this story, but actually, as you're learning as you go along, you see some really, really fascinating lessons, which I think is fascinating. We're going to let Renat, Marco, and Steve have a rest for a second. We're going to do our books of the week. We're actually catching up with some of the books that we were covering in Exchange Invest during the course of the summer. Don't forget, if you want to keep informed about everything that's going on in the parish of exchanges, market structure at all, you can always subscribe to Exchange Invest, exchangeinvest.com. on. The end of August, we had an absolute classic of a book, perhaps the best output that McKinsey ever produced. Lowell Bryan and Diana Farrell's classic roadmap from the turn of the 21st century, outlining how the power of the global market would come into being. Market Unbound, Unleashing Global Capitalism. Still a fantastic read today, ladies and gentlemen. If you can pick it up, and you can usually pick it up secondhand on Amazon, which is even better. Then on the other hand, well, what a contrast we had in the following week. The Firm, the story of McKinsey and its secret influence on American business. It's a tale which is not necessarily quite as positive as a lot of partners of McKinsey might have wished from Duff McDonald, but nonetheless a very interesting tale of what can happen when consultancy goes rampant, which might actually also have a certain parallel into what Steve Zwick's just been talking about when we come to the book we're discussing today, which is absolutely fascinating, The Carbon Paradox. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a joy to have in the audience today, or amongst our guests today, Marco Hirsbrunner, Renat Heuberger, and Steve Zwick, the co-authors of this tome. So Marco, explain to me, how did this book come about? You had the 25 paradoxes. I mean, did you contribute a number of the paradoxes, or was it simply out of discussion between you and Renat? What was the creative function here? I'm fascinated.
Yeah, so in the beginning, it was a discussion among the South Pole founders, and we had, I think, maybe 40 paradoxes or so after a while of collecting all the different ideas. And then Renat and Christoph, Christian and I, we're all in Terra Impact Ventures, we actually started to condense them down and build a little bit of a taxonomy of the paradoxes. So we separated between society paradoxes, project paradoxes, money paradoxes, and we also discovered a little bit an umbrella paradox, which is the ideologies paradox. And then we condensed them into a form that allowed us to publish them as an advent calendar. And so we had 24 paradoxes at that time. So that made a beautiful advent calendar that was then featured on the Illuminem. And then Steve came along when Renat had the idea to actually now let's write a novel around these paradoxes. And over the course of the next months, actually, we've sometimes changed the name of some paradoxes. We've merged some paradoxes again. So it's an ongoing work. We're still discovering new paradoxes, by the way. And yeah, definitely everybody has contributed with a number of paradoxes. We also challenge each other. It's actually intellectually been a super fun and rewarding work. And I especially appreciated the exchange with Steve, who brought in a new perspective, especially from his knowledge of how media works. And yeah, we've had a lot of discussions where we had one proponent who said, yeah, no, but that's a paradox. And somebody else said, no, it's actually just part of another paradox. And yeah, so it's an ongoing discussion.
One man's paradox is another person's object for debate, or however you want to look at it. I have to say, I mean, I really find this book so engrossing. I'm delighted you could join us for this recording, which is taking place or now being shown during the course of the week when you're already engrossed in New York Climate Week. You're probably, by the time everybody's watching this, so famous as a result of this excellent book that you wouldn't be available to talk to us in the future anyway. So thank you very much, Steve, for organizing this discussion. Let me ask you, I mean, Renat, what is your expectation for where you would like the Carbon Paradox to go as a book and what it will achieve?
So let's be very clear. This is not about the book, right? This is about what we're going to do on climate. So we wrote this book not just because we wanted that book to come out, but after 20 years of working in carbon, we believe we need to change the narrative dramatically. Otherwise, this instrument won't scale. And what we observed, and that's also what we have in the book, is that those debates, everything that is in this book is not new. All those debates have been rolling and rolling on and on and on. And what we believe is really important now is to honestly stand here, look at the situation, and ask the question, what would have to happen? What would it take? Under what conditions could we make such an instrument really scale and really make an impact? Because let's keep in mind, there's always an option to do nothing. There's always an option to just give up and say, well, I've read those paradoxes. Shit, that's all too much. I give up. I do nothing. But that's the conclusion. We have to be aware that a lot of the projects that could now be funded to help us reducing carbon emissions are just not going to happen. And we want to advance this discussion. In the book, we have in part 5 a proposal which we tested with a lot of stakeholders. This proposal is feasible. It involves an agreement among many stakeholders around the narrative and around the frame of climate finance at scale. It involves governments, NGOs, academia, the private sector in a cooperation. We believe it's feasible, but we also want to provoke the thought, so if not carbon, then what? Because, and that's my last point here, what we found happening a lot in the media over the past 2 years was that media said, this doesn't work, this is bad, I don't like that, I hate this. But very rarely were people coming up with alternatives. So what are you then proposing if you don't like what you see? And that's the debate we would like to trigger. You should absolutely criticize many things that are there, but you should then also answer the question, what exactly would you do different? And we do hope that this book provides inspiration, thought provoking to launch this debate.
I think it's a fascinating point. And I mean, Steve, it's also a topic we have discussed before, because certainly it seems to me one of the problems with a lot of the broad carbon finance movement has been that certain fringes spend more time trying to destroy elements of the market rather than trying to move it forward. And certainly particularly things like voluntary carbon markets, which I've always been a huge fan of because I thought they were a logical solution. Yet there are people in whom, I mean, it reduces a sort of a carbon market derangement syndrome almost, and they're supposed to actually be on the same side as carbon markets.
Yeah, I mean, that it kind of relates to the crowds paradox or the perfection paradox and other things. I mean, this is, and I think what Renat just said is really critical, that so many of the new, quote unquote, new things being proposed right now have been tried and failed. And it's so important to just make sure, it becomes this Groundhog Day thing where it seems like every couple of years you get this influx of new blood. Everyone's like, oh, I've got this great new idea. And it's like, no, we did that. We tried that in 2008. We tried that in 1998. It didn't work. Right now, the big thing is let's do pure biodiversity credits. Well, that's never worked unless you're, if you're doing biodiversity, if you're buying a biodiversity value that's 1,000 miles away, it's never worked. It's only worked locally when you're offsetting an impact. And the whole field of Red Plus, which you and I have talked about a lot on this show, emerged because there was a willingness to pay for, reducing your carbon impact, and then you could attach biodiversity values to that. So there's all these lessons learned. There's all these debates that we've had, roiling, and now what you're getting are people popping up with, instead of saying, and you had a system that was really aligned about, let's find, so much of this is subjective, so much of this can never really be fully quantified or automated. Let's create a system where you have a way of identifying where do most experts align. That becomes a standard. That's what we implement. Then we implement, we adjust, we move forward. And now it's like we've got this free for all where everyone's coming up with crazy ideas that they're presenting as being brand new. And they're not new. A lot of them are things that we've tried and they just don't work. And by putting all of this stuff in one place, we're hoping that people who are new to the space it will save them a lot of time and trouble, because it's just going to be the same thing over and over again if we don't do that.
So, I mean, therefore, Marco, when you look at this whole thing, and you've obviously got 25 paradoxes you've distilled in this book, as you say, you're already coming up with other paradoxes. So hopefully there's a sequel in there somewhere. And it's an interesting, I know every author sits there and has that rictus grin of, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to write another book at exactly the point when they're just hoping to milk the existing one. But there you go. No, it's a very, very interesting concept of all of these paradoxes together. But is there, therefore, the debate should be focusing on one big single answer that's going to work for everybody? Or are we going to end up with a a dichotomy of the 25 paradoxes result in whatever that number is, 5, 10, 20 different solutions that are going to work for these people, whether they're in darkest Peru or Kenya or wherever they are in the world.
Yeah, no, I think every paradox is a little bit different, right? So there are paradoxes that are really focused on projects, specific technical stuff, and some of them may actually require one unified approach because they might only be tackled through regulation. And then maybe there's going to be one global regulation around one paradox. Others could actually be solved by very different approaches, or simply by acknowledging that the paradox is there. So I think we've had a lot of Dunning-Kruger effect in the media, where a lot of people were totally convinced that they now understood carbon markets, and they understood why they don't work, and were writing a lot of articles about that. And I think now that the carbon markets have collapsed, the voluntary carbon market, there's a little bit of a reckoning, seeing that, well, okay, now there's nothing else there, right? So maybe it wasn't such a good idea to focus on destroying. And I think with this experience, maybe there comes a little bit of, let's say, modesty, a little bit of an acknowledgement that maybe, we need to live with imperfect solutions. And if we acknowledge that, and if the wider public acknowledges that, then I think some of the paradoxes lose their teeth, and they can be solved by simply saying, well, there's not a single way that is the best, and we just have to go in parallel. And as long as the action is genuine, as long as you genuinely try to avoid or reduce emissions on this planet, you should be rewarded for that, and you shouldn't get distracted by this endless infighting of which is the best way and which is the purest way and the most permanent way, and so on. Right? When we actually have a very severe environmental crisis at our footstep, and we need to act now, and we need to really. The work that we need to do is tremendous now, right? So we shouldn't be distracted by too much dispute internally.
I think there's a couple of really great points there. I mean, if you think about it, and one thing that perhaps carbon markets can think about is, I can still remember, gosh, in the mid or late 1980s, I do believe it was The Economist writing a damning indictment of the London International Financial Futures Exchange, and saying that clearly after 4 or 5 years, it was obvious, which it was obvious only to The Economist, that experiment in launching a financial futures market had failed, which I think would come as a very exciting piece of information to the owners of it these days, the Intercontinental Exchange, who rely on it for a huge amount of their profit. And it does seem funny to me that carbon markets are almost immediately written off as a failure, even though nobody's willing to go full cycle, and they need actually in some ways longer to demonstrate the empirical value that they have. Also, I mean, you talk about the paradox of perfection, and I think that's, I mean, for me, that was one of the paradoxes probably hit home most for me, because in a lot of involvement in startups, I mean, we all spend a lot of time shouting at each other and just going, done is better than perfect. And as you say, it's so interesting, Marco, that if you're improving the climate, it doesn't matter whether you're improving the climate perfectly, you're improving the climate, which does seem to be something key. Let me ask you though, out of these 25 paradoxes, do you have a particular favorite? Let's start with Renat.
So I can answer the question 2 ways. First of all, it's not my favorite, but it's probably one of the most fundamental paradoxes that is actually a root cause for many others, is what we call the ethics paradox. The problem is that there are a number of ethical arguments that you can make against the entire concept. And these arguments are valid, right? And they're valid. For example, is it ethically correct to put a price on nature? There is a lot of people who say absolutely not. You should not price water. You should not price a tree, because trees are unpriceable. How can you distinguish a tree with birds versus a tree with butterfly? You cannot and should not put a price on it. Now, the counter argument is, of course, if you then don't put a price on tree, you still do it. Your price is 0. So there's two ethical arguments standing against each other. Another ethical argument, obviously, is it ethically correct or not for, let's say, Swiss or Americans or British to offset their emissions in Kenya? And there's a valid ethical argument that that's absolutely not correct. You should reduce your emissions at home. At the same time, there is an ethical argument which goes like, why wouldn't you fund projects in Kenya? The Kenyans are suffering even more than the Swiss. So again, you have two ethical arguments standing against each other. And that is perhaps a fundamental paradox why a lot of the other paradoxes actually come to life. And so it's unsolvable. Right? This paradox depends on your world view. And it's unsolvable. So what we are trying to do here is to not judge, but just to put those arguments on the table, let them live, let them be part of a debate so that we can at least agree what to do next. So in a way, that's the umbrella paradox that I would single out as the basic one.
Marvelous. The umbrella paradox coming from that. And it is a very interesting ethical issue. Marco, how about you?
Well, I have a lot of favorites, and maybe they change every day, but the one that comes to my mind right now is the avoidance paradox. And I can bring an example outside of the carbon world, from in the plastics world. You have a lot of plastic in the ocean, right? So then you have projects that try to retrieve the plastic from the ocean, and they get a lot of media attention. But wouldn't it be much, much more meaningful to actually avoid the plastic reaching the ocean in the first place? Because there's a lot of plastic that just flows down the rivers, and the concentration of plastic in the rivers is much, much higher than once it reaches the ocean. So it's much, much easier to actually collect plastic out of a river. You're also closer to land where you can then actually recycle that plastic. But paradoxically, the public is just fascinated by devices that use a huge amount of money, effort, and time to find the plastic in the ocean where it's completely diluted and very, very hard to retrieve.
Fascinating. And Steve, tell me, which particular paradox do you take away that you think is particularly special amongst these 25 excellent paradoxes?
Yeah, mine also bounce around from day to day. I think the one that Marco just alluded to, the avoidance and removals paradox, is a big one, mostly because people can visualize something being sucked out of the air. They can visualize a removal. They can't visualize an avoidance. But the paradox that I would have to answer that with right now is the ideologies paradox. It's related to the one that Renat had described, and the reason I think it's important is it explains so much of where we come from. The ethics paradox leads to different ideological approaches to this, and you have people who believe that markets are the cause of all of our evil, and markets cannot be the solution. And it's even written into some of the some of the charters of some organizations, and they stick to that, and everything flows from that. So when you're reading a piece of analysis that comes from a group that has as its stated mission to undermine markets, and that is, and I, they literally do say this sometimes. I'm trying not to name names because that's one thing we're trying to do here, is to not, is to keep it general and abstract. But there are some NGOs that if you look in their charters, it does say that the market economy has caused this problem and cannot be the solution. And it's important that on the one hand, that lets you know that they're coming from a place of bias. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean they're always wrong. Sometimes a group that is motivated by an ideology will find chinks in the armor. They can find holes that should be plugged. But we have to keep in mind that their objective often isn't to fix the market; it's to make sure that it falters. And again, you get this on both sides. We see it on the right wing side in the States right now is I'd say making the same mistake, where they're not trying to really fix something; they're trying to pick it apart and tear it down. So the ideologies paradox is to me an important one, because when you understand the ideological perspective that people are coming from, you can more effectively differentiate or figure out, are they really trying to improve the market, or are they trying to pick it apart and undermine it?
Fantastic altogether. So look, I mean, with this multiplicity of paradoxes in the air, I suppose there's one area of rigidly defined doubt and uncertainty, which is our final question of the day, and I'm going to run it past you. So let me start with you. Renat Heuberger, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
I believe that the moment when we overcome capital markets is beyond the moment when we save the climate. In other words, if we want to have a dent, if we want to really contribute to solving problems, we have to do it with the markets. And I'm very convinced that based on all the lessons we've learned over the past years, the next iteration of academics, the next iteration of financial industry players will have a much better tool set available, also using all the new AI-based tools to actually really make capital markets useful to solve our problems. The tools are all there, the lessons are all learned. I'm very confident that the next round, this time, is going to be different. This time we will make things better than we did last round.
A fascinating synopsis. Thank you very much, Renat Heuberger. And let me ask you, Marco Hirsbrunner, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Well, I think post-singularity, our AI overlords will ensure that all external costs need to be internalized into the product. So you can't simply pollute without paying, or at least that's my hope.
Fascinating. What an interestingly holistic and circular economic argument up front. I love it. Really interesting. Steve, you've been here before several times. You've had an opportunity to talk about these things, but have you anything to add on where you think the capital market revolution is going to go next?
Yeah, I think in this particular context, it will go to more homegrown solutions in developing countries. One thing we've had in carbon finance up till now is that most of the ideas have come from the West and been implemented in developing countries. But what really struck me when I was in Kenya was the amount of homegrown talent, the people who are emerging in these countries to implement projects on their own, whether they're agroforestry, whether it's clean cooking, whether it's clean water. That is where this is moving to, where the solutions will not only be the solutions that are currently being developed in forest nations will now be developed by forest nations. And I think that is going to be the next big revolution within this space.
And on that fascinating note, ladies and gentlemen, it only remains for me to say that during the course of this incredible UN Climate Week, there is a fabulous new book in the ether sphere. Do go get yourselves a copy of The Carbon Paradox right now. It's been a joy to chat to all three authors today, Renat Heuberger, Marco Hirsbrunner, and of course, the incomparable Steve Zwick, a regular on this show. Gentlemen, I wish you all the very, very best with a fascinating book. It's a great read. I thoroughly recommend it. I think I probably am not giving anything away by saying it's a future Exchange Invest book of the week. We'll be bringing that to you in the near future, ladies and gentlemen. It only remains for me to say thank you very much for watching this show, recorded in advance of New York Climate Week, because of course these gentlemen are going to be rock stars signing books for the course of the entire week, probably on people's Kindles in order to preserve the environment. Who knows? And let me say, Exchange Invest will be back in the near future, and we look forward, amongst other things, with IPO-VID to charting the rise of the carbon paradox and seeing how successfully that book's going to go, because I think it's got to be an instant bestseller. My name is Patrick L. Young. Thanks for joining this show. Thank you very much to our production team today. We've had magnificent back office help from AJ, Desiree, and Marianne. IPO-VID will be back, same place, same time next week. Who knows where we'll be by then, ladies and gentlemen, in the ether sphere. And of course, we'll welcome you in Exchange Invest Daily if you're interested in what's going on in the parish of exchange infrastructure and financial markets. My name is Patrick L. Young. Have a great week in life and markets.